Okay, I'd like to get started. So welcome everybody to today's session. I'm Lucien Cloutier. I'm an advisor with Municipal Affairs. Also present today, I have the wonderful assistants from Angela Bilski and Kevin Miller. I can have each of you take a bow. And joining us from Elections Alberta will be Pamela Renwick, who will do a part of the session later on. So just a few housekeeping items. During the session, we ask that you mute your mics and cameras. So I would tell you where the bathrooms are, but you're all in different locations, so you'll have to know where those are. In an unlikely event that your cat spontaneously combusts, please understand where your muster point is outside and dial 911 immediately. So at the end of the session, we will have time for questions. We'll also do our best to answer your questions. However, if for some reason we are unable to, I invite you to reach out to us with your question after the session and we'll provide you with a response. Sometimes things take research and we want to make sure that we get it right. So by way of saying you are here, we are nearing the end of the training. And one thing you'll notice today is that there's some overlap between today's presentation and Module 6. I prefer to think of this as a feature rather than a bug. The reason I've done this is for continuity to tie the activities together. You'll see what I mean as we go through it. It will make it easier to find information in the future if the information is in two spots rather than one. So there's that consideration as well. So along the lines, you may experience some déjà vu. And if you do, that's why. And today's session is all about activities on election day from opening the station until closing it. So let's a familiar slide to some of you. We used the same slide last time to show you some of the most current versions of the legislation that's applicable. So we've got most current version of the LAEA is available on the Queen's Printer's website. It's very, very easy to find, and it's the most up-to-date and accurate, so I highly endorse that. The returning officer manual is emailed out to participants and is now online. And the Alberta Senate and Elections Referendum Act and Education Act are also documents which are pertinent to what we are going to discuss today. By way of a session overview, we will start with a recap of the last session, and that will provide some context, hopefully, moving forward with today's presentation. We'll start with station opening and the activities associated with that. The largest part of today's session is regarding the voting procedures, so there's several slides on that. I'll be providing as much detail as I can, but I would strongly suggest you take the time to read each of the sections in the LAEA that are referenced in the slides to get the entire picture. We can't anticipate every situation that could come up during the day, but we'll address what we can within the LAEA. I will also do a section on controlling traffic, and in here we'll discuss such things as scrutineers and politely shoving people out of the station once they've completed voting. We'll talk about what happens when it comes time to close the station. And as mentioned, we will have a presentation by Elections Alberta. And then we'll open the session up for questions. I'll try to answer as many questions as I can. There is always the possibility that some questions require further review. And I think I've said that already. Anyway, if there are any questions that are still outstanding, please feel free to get a hold of us. We will respond to you and we will get the answer to you. So I will be referencing a number of forms today, and that's why I provided the homework as I did. You may want to open those forms at the link sent out in our email, or you may wish to review the forms section of our returning officers handbook. I'm just going to move this to get this out of my way. You can access off of our elections overview page. I want to start with a bit of a recap of Module 6, and it ties in very much so with today's module. Angela brought us through a number of things regarding voting opportunities. So some of those topics included voter eligibility, who can vote, and what are the rules of residency. So those are the sections 47 and 48. Identification, various forms accepted, establishing bylaws for expanding the type and number of the use of a list of electors, and vouching, which has new and improved processes for allowing an elector who hasn't vouched for anyone yet and hasn't been vouched for to vouch for the electors of one household. And I will include a little bit on that a little later in my session as well. That seemed to, sorry about that. Voting subdivisions and passing bylaws to allow multiple stations for voting for subdivisions and wards, voting compartments, ballot boxes and ballots, alternative voting options, advance vote, special ballots. And just to confirm, the rules around which parties can receive special ballots remain unchanged, and also talk about providing elector assistance and alternative voting systems. Now, we're going to talk about opening the station on election day. So as all of you are probably know, election day is October 18th, 2021, or the third Monday in October. Voting hours are between 10 a.m. and 8 p.m. unless your municipality has a bylaw passed prior to June 30th stating that your voting station may open early. At 10 a.m. on election day, the deputy returning officer responsible for the voting station must ensure that the unsealed ballot box is shown to the individuals at the voting station and that it is sealed prior to accepting the votes. The seal should ensure that the ballots cannot be opened without breaking the seal. It must be placed in the view of the presiding deputy and in the view of those present in the voting station. If additional ballot boxes are required, each ballot box should be shown to those present and sealed in the same manner. So about the seals, they can be just about anything that ensures a ballot box cannot be opened or tampered with without being visibly noticeable. Seals can be mailing labels, duct tape, packing tape, seals provided by tabulator companies if you're using tabulators. A fundamental tenet of, so just to note, at one time, my understanding is there was a prescribed tape that was used, and that is no longer the case since actually quite a long time. A fundamental tenet of the democratic process is to provide for secrecy of the vote. Thus, all voting during the election is done by secret ballot. When an elector is in a compartment, they must be free to mark their ballots free of interruption or interference. I'm going to just back up here a little bit, and I want to add one little thing to our recap from our Module 6. So one thing I want to discuss was with regards to ballot boxes and numbers of ballot boxes. So we had a number of questions on whether or not you can use your ballot boxes for all your contests, like municipal and school, for example. And the answer is it depends. What it depends on is what your agreement says with the school division. So are you keeping the custody of the ballot boxes, or are you turning them after the election day? Some municipalities use one ballot box per station and just color code the ballots. But the Act provides for some flexibility, leaving this decision up to the municipality. When we get to the Elections Alberta section of today's session, the representative from Elections Alberta will explain the requirements regarding ballot boxes, and their ballots are color-coded as well, just to mention. And one final note is just a bit of an odd clause. It really is an odd clause. Section was what is stated in section 75.2 of the LAEA. That section states that for advance votes, if your municipality has wards, you must have separate ballot boxes for each authority. It's a strange clause, but that is what the requirement is. So. All right, so we went through the this section with regards to election day, and I believe everything here is the same. So now we're going to talk to you about some of the voting procedures. So this is going to be a series of slides, starting with instructions for voters. So each voting station must have the instructions for voters as set out on Form 10 displayed somewhere conspicuous and convenient to access in the voting station, and another set of instructions must be put in each voting booth. The instructions should be large enough for voters to read. So the one you have on the wall and the one you have in the compartment might be different sizes, but they need to just be big enough so that voters can read it. Section 57, an elector may only vote once for each contest. For example, mayor, school board, trustee, etc. Note that in individual contests, such as one for councillor, if you elect councillors at large, for example, the elector can vote for up to the maximum number of candidates as specified on the ballot, but they're only given one ballot for that purpose. So next we get to a little bit where the rubber hits the road. That has to do with the voter identification portion, which is section 53. So the electors either have to have their name on a list of electors, which very few, if any, municipalities use, or they have to make a statement, which is the vast majority of you will be using the Form 13, the elector register, and provide identification, which is either government issued ID that has a photograph, including the person's name and address. So quite often a driver's license. If they don't have that, have a piece of government picture ID that has both their name and address, then they have to provide a piece of the ID that's on the list provided by the chief electoral officer under the Elections Act that has both the person's name and address. So one thing to mention is if they have a SIN card, that's an example of ID that doesn't work because it doesn't have an address on it. So even though there are things on that list that are on that list, they don't necessarily work. They have to have both name and address in order for them to be useful. They also these provisions can also be changed by municipality by bylaw if they've passed a bylaw that requires additional number of ID or additional forms of ID that'll be accepted. So somebody comes to the voting station with no ID. What to do? Well, there are expanded provisions to allow for vouching. Now an elector can vouch for another elector, provided that the person's vouching only vouch for the electors of one household and that the person vouching has not themselves been vouched for. Scrutineers are not allowed to vouch for anyone. So we've had the question on vouching for Hatarian and similar colonies. We suggest you contact your legal counsel for their advice on whether or not a colony is considered one household for the purpose of vouching. But now that we've said that, if any of today's participants have already looked into this circumstance and would like to share any insight in the chat box, feel free to do so. You may well be better versed on it than we are. So the voucher has to complete the prescribed form 14, which is one of the forms that I mentioned to you for today. So they are vouching that they know the electors and that they can verify their address. It's important that the voucher reads the form because by signing it, they're committing to their eligibility to do so, and it would be an offense to make a false statement. At the end of this presentation, there's a link to the voter ID used by Elections Alberta. And remember that not all forms of ID on that list can be used. There must be a name and current address. And although I've said that, I don't mind saying it again because it's a pretty important point to drive home. So one of the mainstays of the election day is the elector register. So the elector has presented their ID, and now you're giving them the Form 13, the elector register, to read and sign. Their name and address gets written on the form. You're going to number the register sequentially so that at the end of the night, you know how many voting registers were completed. Then the elector reads and signs the form. They don't need to read it out loud, but they do need to read it and sign it. And by signing it, they're making a statement of which it would be, again, an offense to make a false statement. One thing to note here, we often get the question as to how you confirm that somebody didn't vote more than once, such as attending an advance vote and then voting on election day. And the answer is that you can't. That's why they make the statement, and that's also why scrutineers can make objections. And speaking of objections, if a candidate, official agent, or a scrutineer objects to a person who is making a statement, voting register, or elector assistance form, the deputy is required to note on the voting register the reason for the objection and the name of the person making the objection, and the deputy then initials this entry. And it's important to note that the objection is only allowed to be made at the time the elector is making their statement. If they've left the station, it is too late. It has to be made at the time that they're making their statement. If the returning officer on reasonable and probable grounds believes that a person is not an eligible elector, the returning officer must make a note in the voting register and indicate the reason for it and initial. Very important note here, and I've had this question before, objecting to an elector does not stop the elector from voting. If the elector has signed the voting register and provided proper ID, they get ballots and they're permitted to vote. Another important thing to note under section 93.1, at the completion of the counting of the ballots, and this will be in the next module, but I want to mention it now anyway. Under section 93.1, at the completion of the counting of the ballots, the presiding deputy shall make a packet of the elector registers of which an objection has been noted in accordance with section 54, if any, separate from the packet made under subsection 91F that contains the rest of the elector registers. So this is a change from previously. Previously, you'd make a copy of the register. So when someone has been objected to, you're going to set that voting register aside, and since it will be kept separately at the end of the night, that will be a voting register that ends up not going in the ballot box, but into a separate exterior packet. When you issue the ballots to somebody who's been objected to, you do not mark the voter's ballot in any way other than initialing it like you normally would. There is nothing attaching the objection to that voter's ballot. That's on purpose, and that supports the principle of keeping the secrecy of the vote. So now that you've dealt with any objections, you need to issue ballots. You need to check off the boxes for all the ballots you issue. Electors don't have to vote for everything that they wished to vote for. Some people maybe, for instance, you might have an elector that only wants to vote for mayor, etc. So if your process is to hand out only the ballots requested, then that's what you do. Or if your process is to hand all the ballots out, if they return any that they've declining to vote for, then those will be declined ballots, and we're going to talk about those in just a second. So if you're using a tabulator, you may have all these things combined in one ballot, and the elector simply will not vote for any contest that they choose not to vote for on the combined ballot. So, and if you are using tabulators, follow any instructions that are in your bylaw regarding issuance of ballots. Make sure you, and not the elector, and I've seen that before, initial each ballot that you issue to the electors on the back. I've actually seen electors think that they have to initial it somehow, but that again would defeat the purpose of the secrecy of the vote. So please keep an eye out for that. Electors are not the ones that are to initial the ballots. It's the DRO or the person, the presiding officer, whomever at the returning officer that's going to be issuing those ballots. The elector will then be directed to a voting booth where they will complete the voting process. You must be prepared to assist a voter if they have questions about the voting process, and you can direct them to Form 10, which is in the voting booth, as well as up on the wall in the voting station. You can go through the form with them if they require the assistance. When the elector returns the ballot to you, the ballot needs to be folded so as to not reveal how they voted and to show the initials of the DRO. Many voters can be very careless with their ballots, try to save them from themselves and try to help them keeping that secrecy of the vote. It's an important principle. Then the ballots are deposited into the ballot box by the DRO. The Act also allows the DRO to permit the elector to deposit the ballot. If you're going to have electors deposit the ballots, watch them very carefully to make sure that any ballot goes into the right box and not any ballots into the wrong box, because then that's just going to complicate things later on when you go to do the counting, especially since you might be sitting there wondering what happened to a ballot. There's one unaccounted for kind of thing. Once someone has voted, politely kick them out of the station. It's not a place to stay and chat with neighbors. We'll talk about managing traffic a bit and expand on this a bit more. Slide 3 of voting procedures. We're going to talk about elector assistance. So if an elector is unable to read or does not understand the English language, the deputy may allow an interpreter to read or translate the statement, as well as any questions necessary for the proper purposes of the election put to the elector and the elector's answers. So before acting as an interpreter, the interpreter shall make a statement in the prescribed form. And for this, you use the Swiss Army knives of the election forms, the multi-purpose Form 17, Statement of Interpreter, etc. It's got a whole long name, but it's the Form 17. The interpreter is required to complete the first section of the Form 17 and sign it. It may be necessary for the DRO to read the second section to the elector. Remember to put your initials if you use this second section. Also, if you need to fill out the section at the bottom of Form 13, elector register. So you need to also reference this on the elector's register that you've used this Form 17. Section 78 also allows a friend or relative to assist the elector, and once again, you would use Form 17 to administer the friend or relative. So you see that third section of Form 17, that's going to be one where the DRO needs to initial the form on section Form 17 that has been used to complete the appropriate section at the bottom of the voting register. So you have to do the stuff on Form 17 as well as the stuff at the bottom of the Form 13. At the request of an elector, a DRO must assist the marking of a ballot of a voter who is experiencing visual impairment or in another way has a physical disability. Prior to embarking on this process, the election worker must read the verbal statement in the Form 17 to the elector and then initial it if they answer in the affirmative. It is also possible that your municipality has passed a bylaw to allowing for blind voter templates. The details of this process are under Section 78 of the Act, and I suggest that you review this section carefully if your municipality is offering this service. A DRO does not have to make the statement of friend or relative of elector who is unable to vote in the usual manner. However, the statement of elector who is unable to vote in the usual manner section of the elector's voting register form, Form 13, must be completed. So you're still going to do that bit at the bottom of the Form 13, even though you yourself may not need to because you're the DRO, have to complete that other form. Section 78 5.1 also allows a special voting compartment to be set up for an elector that is unable to go to the usual voting compartments to vote. So do your best to follow the requirements of the Act as closely as possible to upkeep the secrecy of the vote. Some larger stations especially set aside a spot for doing this very thing. If either the DRO or a friend or relative mark the ballots for the elector, the deputy shall enter into the elector's register opposite the name of the elector, either elector assistance or template as is the case. The Form 17 essentially becomes part of the elector register, so that when the Form 17 is completed, it must be kept with the voting register for this elector. You can use a paper clip if you wish, whatever you like to do, but the point is that you have to keep it together with the voting register. Now, I want to talk about spoiled ballots. To quote that one guy from that one movie, you keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. And I'm talking about spoiled ballots as contemplated by Section 65 of the LAEA and not what some people think of as spoiled ballots. So, repeat after me. Spoiled ballots are not the same thing as void or rejected ballots. So, okay, say it twice. Section 65 states, an elector who has inadvertently dealt with the elector's ballot in a manner that it cannot be conveniently used as a ballot, A, on returning it to the deputy, and B, on establishing the fact of the inadvertence to the satisfaction of the deputy, receive another ballot in the place of the ballot so returned. So an example of this might be a voter that's accidentally torn their ballot. An elector who has, filling out a ballot for councillor and puts in one X too many and then goes, oh no, my ballot's going to be, is not going to be counted because I haven't done this correctly. And they come back and they say, I need a different ballot. That is what's considered to be a spoiled ballot as it's used in this act. So if the deputy is satisfied that this was a spoiled ballot, the deputy shall immediately write the word spoiled on the return ballot and shall preserve it. You should have a packet marked spoiled, and this is where the ballot goes. So this is totally different than a void or rejected ballot, which is something that will be covered in our next training session. That's something that's covered in the section regarding the counting of ballots as opposed to the voting process. Totally different thing. sometimes there's confusion in the name. Spoiled refers to something that happens during the voting process, and void or rejected refers to something in the counting process. Let's see, I've given you basically that example already. And now, so you've issued a ballot to an elector. Upon further consideration, the voter comes back to your table and advises they've changed their mind. They're not going to vote for one or more of the contests for which they've been handed a ballot. What do you do with that ballot? Section 66 says, if an elector returns a ballot and states that the elector is declining to vote, the elector is not entitled to another ballot for that office, and the deputy who is supervising at the ballot box shall deposit the declined ballot in the ballot box. That's where a declined ballot goes. It might be surprising to some, might be surprising to your elector. They've said, here, I've decided not to vote for this. You take the ballot, you put it in the box. That might evoke a response, but those are the instructions that are in the Act. And a few other things to capture regarding voting procedures. We're going to start with scrutineers. Candidates may appoint scrutineers for the purposes of observing the voting procedures during advance vote and election day. A scrutineer must be at least 18 years of age and must present to the presiding deputy a written notice signed by the candidate and stating that the person is representing the candidate as a scrutineer at the voting station. There isn't a prescribed form for this. The next part there is, though. So the letter or note that they get from the candidate is not the same as the Form 16. The Form 16 is the thing that happens after. So prior to observing any of the process, the scrutineer must make the statement prescribed on Form 16 in the presence of the returning officer or presiding deputy. At any time throughout the day, only one of the candidate, scrutineer, or official agent may be present. So either the candidate or the scrutineer or the official agent serving as that role as scrutineer. We'll talk more about controlling traffic in a bit, so we'll discuss that part too. Any person who has been convicted of an election-related offense is not eligible to be a scrutineer. Section 58 of the Act deals with voting time for employees. Now, this is in the general context of employees, not specific to election workers, although there's a consideration there too, but this is just in general. In essence, it states that an employee must be given 3 consecutive hours on election day to vote. So see this section for further details. There are some additional details that go with it, but the take-home message is that employees in general must be given a 3-hour consecutive window in which to vote. For your election workers, if they wish to vote in the general election, it's a good idea to suggest that they attend an advance vote if the municipality for which they are an elector is holding one. So your electors might not be from the same municipality. Suppose you're a county and they live in town, or vice versa. Then, you know, if that doesn't work for them, they could also try to get a special ballot if that municipality is offering special ballots. And Section 83 also allows the returning officer, upon the request of one or more of their election workers, to provide that worker with a certificate which allows them to attend a voting station that is other than the voting station which they're entitled to vote. So suppose they're in one voting subdivision and they're working the voting station for a different voting subdivision. Let's say in this example, the same ward, but there's 2 voting subdivisions and they're working at the other one. They could have that certificate that allow them to do that. It's also possible that you may have workers that are at the station that they would be eligible to go to vote. And they can do that subject to ensuring that you have enough personnel to work that station as they're serving them, as they're acting as a voter at that time. So pretty much covered that. The worker presents when voting, the worker presents the certificate, and that gets attached to their voting register. So if you've issued a certificate to somebody when they do go to vote, that gets attached to their voting register. So Section 68 states, no person who has received a ballot from the DRO shall take the ballot out of the voting station. If they do, they forfeit their right to vote at the election, and the deputy shall record in the elector's register an entry to that effect, that the person left the voting station without first delivering the ballot, and your ballot account will be out by that vote because you no longer have it in your possession. So, that is something you're going to have to note. If somebody does that, then make sure that you make a note of it, and you'll also, like I say, you'll also know that your account's going to be out. Controlling traffic at the station. So there are many factors to consider when choosing a station, especially these days. How is the property laid out? How is the access and the egress? Will it be difficult to manage the flow of traffic coming into and out of the station? Choosing layouts which avoid people passing near the voting compartments is important. Remember, this is a secret vote, and maintaining the secrecy is very important. Do you have a plan set up in case of an emergency? Is there a muster point? While a fire is unlikely, it's possible that an individual elector, and it is possible that an individual elector could require medical assistance. How are you set up to deal with that? What can you do to do that? These are going to be things which are going to be highly dependent on your circumstances, and they're brought up here just so that you think of them. Do you need to have a constable assigned to the station? And if you do, check out section 15 and what it says about that. Regarding COVID, the elections overview page, which we will provide a link for shortly, provides a guide to which is intended to help you identify issues when operating a voting station. Section 67 lays out the rules for having persons at the voting station. It allows the following to be present at the station: election staff, obviously, a candidate or their agent or their scrutineer, one at a time, electors actively involved in the election process or waiting for their turn to do so. It also allows the presiding officer to permit someone to temporarily observe the process. You have to instruct them on a place that such an observer is to stand, such that it does not interfere with the voting process or the secrecy of the vote. If it's the media, for example, we had this question last time about the media there and they wanting to take pictures and such. More than the election process really is the FOIP considerations, the considerations of individual privacy. And ideally, nobody should be having their picture taken without consenting to do so. So you want to consider that very carefully before allowing the media to do so. Some places have staged, done a little bit of a staging to have it because, as you may know, sometimes there are situations where candidates will go to a voting station and want to have that, the media wants to capture that candidate casting their own vote, sort of a thing. You have to be very cognizant of who else is in there and ensuring that nobody is inadvertently getting their picture taken that doesn't want to. So scrutineers should be directed to a location where they can perform their duty of scrutinizing the voting process while not interfering with the voting process. During the counting process, which will be covered in the next session, it's important that scrutineers are positioned so they can see the ballots as they are being counted, because that's part of their process, is to raise objections to the counting of ballots, but not so close as to be able to touch or handle the ballots, which would be a big, big no-no. I think that's the term they use in the act, big, big no-no, not sure. So once a person is done voting, remind them of the way out. This is not a place to exchange recipes or hunting or fishing stories. So it's 8 o'clock or 7 o'clock in Newfoundland. In 7 o'clock in a summer village. And at 8 o'clock or 7, depending on where you are, the presiding deputy shall declare the voting station closed. If there is an elector in the voting station at 8 p.m. who wishes to vote and has not yet done so, they shall be permitted to do so. Basically, what happens at this point is the door becomes one way. You can let people out, but you cannot let others in to vote. And this now brings us to the post-vote procedure, which is the substance of the next training session. Bonus slide, free bonus. We're going to provide some scenarios and we're going to play a little bit of game of allowed or not allowed. So it's the new deal or no deal. So situation number 1, voter wearing a candidate's button at the station. Allowed or not allowed? Not allowed. It's an advertisement in a station. See section 152. You're going to have them remove that button. Situation 2, worker needs a comfort break leaving the station with only one worker at the ballot box. Our position is that this is not allowed, as we follow the rule of 2. Position of municipal affairs is that there must be 2 people at the ballot box at all times. If necessary, you can suspend the voting until the person comes back. Ideally, you're always going to have 2 workers at the ballot box, and staff yourself accordingly. So, election sign for candidates just outside the station. Once again, section 152 says, yeah, no, this is not allowed. You have to have them remove it. What about the media showing up wanting to take a picture? We've kind of discussed that already. It could be allowed, but there would have to be circumstances that are more on the nature of FOIP than they are about the election itself, because there is the provision that says a presiding officer may allow somebody to observe temporarily. Just to the last line that's on this slide about having backup plans. Have backup plans in your back pocket in case something happens to your stations. I have had this happen. I used a senior center instead of a community center. In a community center, we had a gas leak that was not serious enough to pose a hazard of explosion, but strong enough that it was going to make it very difficult for the workers to work there all day. And we ended up having to put up signs and direct people to the senior center. And fortunately, everything went off without a hitch. So it's good to have these sort of ideas in the back of your head. What would you use as a backup station? How would you let people know? Those kinds of things to do. And possibly even more important than that, at least in my experience, is to have extra workers, spares to fill where needed. And I would have these extra workers take the very same training that you're going to give to your other deputy returning officers and ensure that they are ready to go in case you have somebody that doesn't show up, in case you have an unexpected traffic flow at a location and need another pair of hands. It's good to have spare people if you can. Not everybody's going to be in a situation where you can have that, but if you can have that, by all means, have spares available to help pitch in whenever possible. You might be able to use counting crews. One of the things that you do have to be cognizant of is that somebody that's been there all day is going to be possibly a bit physically or mentally fatigued. If you can arrange it so that you split your shifts and you have fresher eyes to do the counting process, then that's a consideration as well. I can't go in through all the scenarios. The point here being, give these things some thought. How can you arrange this so that you have the adequate personnel in the places? What are you going to do in the case of a backup? I'll tell you one more very quick little anecdotal story. I was working for a rural municipality, and I was driving around from station to station to make sure that everything was fine with their setups. I had a vehicle lined up for election day, and I had a backup vehicle lined up for election day. Well, the vehicle lined up for election day hit a deer on the way in. But I had planned for that, so I had my backup vehicle. It was very icy that day, and ended up putting it in the ditch to avoid a wolf. I didn't have a backup to the backup vehicle, and so we had to improvise on the spot. The point of the moral of the story is that just put some good thought into what you're going to do, contingency plans, and what you're going to do to ensure that you have all things in place. It's way better to have things in place that you don't end up using than it is to have to try to improvise on the spot. Another thing that I would strongly recommend is that you make sure your technology is in line, especially for things like reporting, and make sure that you have your plan in place in terms of how and when you are going to report your unofficial results. It's really important to have that in place. You're going to have some very interested parties who want results as soon as possible. So make sure you put some thought into exactly how you're going to lay that out to them. Listing some resources here. We have our elections overview page, our Election Alberta resources, and Elections Alberta resources, etc. So you can check that page out. And this does bring us to the next portion, which is going to be the section which will be delivered by Elections Alberta. So I will turn that over to them at this time.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. Which screen I want to share. There we go. All right, hope everyone's doing well today. So like Lucien's mentioned, and if you haven't already been to a presentation, my name is Pamela Renwick, and I'm the Director of Operations and Communications with Elections Alberta. So it's good to see everyone again, at least virtually, as we move on to Module 7 of the Election Training Program. So Lucien covered the details of the voting process under the Local Authorities Election Act in his presentation, and those are the same voting processes that are going to apply to Senate election and the referendum vote. And there's very little modification that you'll need to do to be able to add these votes. What we are going to do though today, we're going to walk through a few areas of differences. So we're going to look at rules for voting, ballots and ballot boxes, processes for issuing the ballots, how we're going to address spoiled and declined ballots, and processes for scrutineers. First, we'll look at elector eligibility, which also follows the Local Authorities Election Act. Eligible electors are 18 years of age or over, Canadian citizens, and resident in the local jurisdiction in which they wish to vote. Electors with multiple residences must designate one as their place of voting. And so this is very important for the Senate election and referendum vote, as each elector may only vote once. For electors that wish to vote in the summer village, they must be residents of that summer village. When issuing the Senate election and referendum ballot to electors, Deputy Returning Officers should confirm that the elector has not already voted. Now, while we talked about ballots in Module 5 quite extensively, I wanted to review the requirements again in the context of how it affects how the ballot is being issued. So on the screen, we've got it split into two columns. So first, we're going to talk about jurisdictions that are using regular ballots. So in this case, Elections Alberta will provide the Senate election and referendum ballot. These ballots are printed on colored paper to help you distinguish them from other ballots that you are also issuing. The Senate ballot is yellow and the referendum is gray. Deputy Returning Officers will issue one of each ballot to the elector. And prior to issuing it, they're going to fold each ballot along the fold lines and initial the back. Now we're on to the second column, and that's for jurisdictions that are using alternative voting equipment. So in this case, Elections Alberta does not provide the ballots. The jurisdiction is going to work with their voting equipment vendor to provide the ballots. And so those may be printed if the municipality is using a tabulator, or they may be digital if the municipality is using other equipment such as vote kiosks. In this case, the ballot colors do not apply. Tabulator ballots will be printed on the paper required by your vendor. You may also choose to use a composite ballot in this case. So that is where we see multiple contests on one ballot over multiple pages of a ballot. And the format of the ballot is set out in the municipality's bylaw. Although for consistency purposes, the legislation does set out specific requirements for what must be included on the ballot. And we covered those in Module 5. And we also have instructions available that we can share with any of your vendors. We've already shared those instructions with ES&S and Dominion, so they have them. But if you have a different vendor and you'd like us to share the instructions, please reach out. Now, as the ballots are different between municipalities, the rules for ballot boxes also change depending on the ballot type being used. For municipalities that are using the regular ballot, you will be issuing two ballots, and each should be deposited in its own ballot box. So one box for the Senate election ballot and one box for the referendum ballot. As this adds to the ballot boxes that you already have in the voting place, each ballot box should be clearly labeled to assist the Deputy Returning Officer and elector in depositing the ballots in the correct boxes. So this may include the use of color or the event name on the box. Now for municipalities that are using alternative voting equipment, such as a tabulator, multiple ballot boxes are not required. In this case, a single tabulator and ballot box may be used for all ballots in the voting place if you're using a composite ballot. Now, before we move on from ballot boxes, we also need to cover the exceptions for municipalities that have entered into a partnership agreement with another jurisdiction. So this would include jurisdictions that are conducting the vote on behalf of a First Nation community or on behalf of a summer village, if that occurs, or it could apply if multiple summer villages are working together to provide this voting opportunity by appointing one returning officer to conduct it for multiple. For municipalities that are not entering into a partnership agreement or have no idea what I'm talking about with those, you can ignore this and the next slide. So in these jurisdictions where you have a partnership agreement, we're going to provide you with the flexibility to choose how you would like to collect the ballots and report the results. So in option 1, all ballots for the jurisdictions within the partnership agreement are collected together in the same ballot boxes. You would still require a ballot box for the Senate election and a ballot box for the referendum vote, but you would not require a ballot box for each jurisdiction separately. And you can see that in my very simple diagram of ballot boxes. In this case, the count of ballots will be a combined count. So the ballots in the ballot boxes represent 2 or more jurisdictions. To ensure an accurate representation of the vote counts, Elections Alberta needs to know which municipalities are choosing this option, and this is communicated through the elections database. So the primary municipality, which for this slide we're going to call Municipality A, is responsible to complete the data entry and report which municipalities they are partnering with. In this case, Municipality A is partnering with Municipality B. All the election database entry is including the combined results reporting, is completed in Municipality A screens, and nothing is completed in the screens for Municipality B. So this does reduce your ballot boxes in the polls, but one drawback of this approach is that your municipality results will be combined with the other jurisdiction. You will have no capacity to have municipality level results. So if you are concerned and you want to be able to report your results separately, then you would need to consider option 2. So in option 2, the ballots for each jurisdiction within the partnership agreement are collected separately in their own ballot boxes. As you would still require a ballot box for the Senate election and a ballot box for the referendum vote, you would need to clearly label the municipality and the event on each ballot box. So as you can see in my simple ballot box drawing, we now have 4 ballot boxes representing 2 municipalities and both events. So in this case, the count of ballots will be for each municipality separately. So in this scenario, data entry for each municipality should be completed separately in the elections database. You would not need to enter the municipality that you are partnering with, as you would be entering full details in both municipalities. Once the count of ballots is completed, you would report the results for Municipality A, and then you would report the results for Municipality B, keeping it separate through the entire process. So those are your 2 options. I, of course, can't actually see you, so I'm hoping that makes sense for those that are in partnership agreements. If it doesn't, or you want to talk about the options in more detail, feel free to contact us and we can walk through what's going to work best for you. So now that we've covered the ballots and the ballot boxes, we will go over the modifications for issuing ballots. The first is the form to use for the elector register. So Form 13 RSE is to be used, as it allows deputy returning officers to record the issuance of the Senate election and referendum ballots within the same form. So this form will be posted to the Municipal Affairs Elections form site shortly. And you can see on the form piece that I've put on the screen, it's just 2 extra check boxes to take care of recording that those ballots are being issued. Someone's doing some funny things to the screen. Didn't know you had that option. Interesting. The other area that will differ is in the instructions that are provided to the elector on these ballots. What is shown on the slide is an example of what the instructions may look like. For the Senate election, we must instruct the elector in how many candidates they may select. We will not know this number until the order is issued. For the referendum, we do not know the number of questions that will be asked, and we do not know the format of the questions. We are assuming that they are all yes/no questions, which simplifies our voting instructions. And so these will be finalized once the order is issued and we know the number and format of the questions. Now for spoiled and declined ballots, the processes that are followed are the same processes that you're following for your municipal ballots. Electors are eligible for replacement Senate and referendum ballots if they have made an error or the ballot is damaged in some way. These will have to be accounted for on the ballot account and result of vote form following the count, so deputy returning officers will need a process to retain the spoiled ballots. Electors are also able to decline to vote in the Senate election or referendum vote. And as with municipal ballots, the process to do this is to deposit a blank ballot into the ballot box. These will also be captured on the ballot account and result of vote form following the count. And the line that you use is called rejected ballots, on which no vote was cast by an elector. And in Module 8, we're going to go through the post-vote procedure, so we'll get more into what that form is going to look like. And finally, I wanted to mention scrutineers. There are no additional rules regarding scrutineers for the Senate election or referendum vote, so the processes within the Local Authorities Election Act will apply. If a Senate election candidate wants to appoint scrutineers to a voting place, they would need to contact the RO for the municipality to receive any municipality-specific instructions for doing so. This is one area of candidate management that Elections Alberta is not able to do. For the referendum vote, as there is no identified political participants, we are not anticipating any appointments of scrutineers. That is the end of the modifications for Senate election and referendum to your election day processes. I just wanted to briefly review the timelines for submitting your election details and supply orders to us. So remember, this can be done in the elections database or by using the PDF fillable form on our website. We have instructions on how to do either the PDF or the database entry on our website as well if you're having any difficulties with that. So far we've had about 150 municipalities have submitted that information, which is great to see. But if you have not done that yet, if you could please go in there and submit information as soon as possible, that would be great. I understand that if you don't have your returning officer appointed yet, you might not have the ability to do the election details. But then if you can do the supply details and your estimates there, that would be good. It can just help me figure out how much to order. And before we get to questions, I wanted to share with you that Elections Alberta is currently recruiting returning officers throughout the province. Just last week, we posted on our website 37 returning officer positions that cover many rural and urban electoral divisions. So if you're interested in finding out more about what a provincial election is like, please check it out. The posting will close on June 2nd. We will also be advertising this posting in local newspapers, job boards, and online. And if you know of anyone that might be interested or would like to share our social media posting with your followers, that would be great. So now we will move on to questions. And as always, we are available for municipality specific questions after the sessions. Our contact information is included on this slide. Although with all of us working from home, it's usually best if you use the email address and then we're able to pick that up quickly and get back to you. And that is all from me.
All right. Thank you very much for that. And I'd like to go over some of the questions now that were asked. So I'm just going to kind of go through them here. So somebody's new this year. We're using an electors list. Can an elector read the oath aloud to swear it? So there's a couple things in this particular question, a statement and a question. If a jurisdiction is using a list of electors under Section 50 of the LAEA, electors do not have to fill out the Form 13 or provide ID. Electors do not have to read the oath aloud if they are using the Form 13, if there is no list of electors. So you might want to clarify, first of all, that you actually do have a bylaw in place, that you will be using a list of electors or that you'll be putting one in place, and ensure that that's actually the case. Most municipalities do not use and instead use the Form 13 to collect the electors register for collecting statements from electors. Are there consequences for people who make false statements? It is considered to be an offense, and it can be pursued through the Provincial Offences Act. So that is possible that could happen as a result of it. Again, part of the process is scrutineers, and scrutineers being involved in making objections when somebody they believe is not eligible to vote is voting. Another question that we get at just about every session is regarding post office box numbers, which is a reality if you're a ruralite, and I lived most of my life with a post office box, so I understand this question completely. So the question is a post box number as an address instead of a street address with a name an acceptable form of ID on a document? So if a voter's identification shows post office box number as the address instead of a residential or legal address, it can be accepted as verification if the current address is in reasonable distance to the voting jurisdiction. So there's kind of I guess I would call it a bit of a sniff test with regards to where the place name that's listed in their address is. Next question, a government issued check with the name and address is allowable, but what about somebody's personal checkbook? So personal check showing name and address is acceptable. If an interpreter is not available, can we use a translating app on a cell phone? Very, very interesting technological question, and certainly something that up to this point technologically hasn't been addressed in the Act. I would use some caution here. You must be cautious given it's not provided for in the legislation, which means the person operating the app doesn't know for certain that the translation is accurate. Typically, parties involved in translation are both informed and knowledgeable about the language. If this is a direction your municipality wants to sanction, we would suggest that you would get a legal opinion before you're doing that, just to ensure that it complies with the legislation, just in case you are challenged for using that tool. How many scrutineers are a nominee allowed to have? The short answer is an infinite number, but the answer that you might or might not be asking is how many can you have at one station at once? And the answer is one. One scrutineer, one agent, or one candidate serving as a scrutineer at a station at a time. Although you may have many scrutineers, you can only have them doing that duty, one per station, one at a time. If COVID is ongoing and mask requirements are still in place, how should we address scrutineers who want to enter a voting station without a mask, citing a medical exemption? I think this is one of those circumstances where you're going to do the best that you can with it, ensuring that your scrutineer has distancing. Ideally, if you have a way to set up a plastic barrier or something, a transparent plastic barrier, to try to make it so that it's a safe arrangement as possible. I think that's probably what you're going to do. Try to comply with the health provisions as closely as possible while still trying to provide that ability for that scrutineer to complete their duties. It's certainly not an ideal setup, but I think that you do the best you can with it. Can voting hours be expended if there's an emergency that results in the temporary closure of a voting station? And I am unaware of any provision that provides for this. So as far as I know, the answer is no. I would bow to my colleagues if they have any additional information to add on that. Gone. Okay. If the council wishes to ask their residents a question on the ballot, when does that have to be decided on? And it says, i.e. June 30th. And is it done by resolution or is added to the election bylaw? So it is possible to add a question to the ballot as for example, a non-binding vote of electors. Understand that that's a completely different process than referendum. That's a completely different thing, different provisions in the Act. On this particular one, I'm going to invite you to contact me so that I have a little bit more time to research all the time periods that are involved in that. But the answer is yes, you could have a non-binding vote of the electors, or I suppose you could have a binding one too that goes to that it gets decided on election day as well. And please reach out to us for some more information on what that process looks like. If we do not have a ward system, can we place all the ballots into one box per station for all contests, or do we need to have separate boxes for each contest at each station? So again, I'll just go back to there's that one anomaly. If you happen to be an advance vote and you happen to have a ward system, then you have to have separate boxes for each elected authority. And that's the only place in the Act where it speaks to this. The problem is a practical one. if you're going to keep things all in one ballot box, you have different ballot boxes which may need to go to different parties and have different retention periods. So you're going to have to figure out the logistics of that. And that has more to do with what you're going to do with your ballot boxes after the process, as opposed to any provision in the act requiring you to have separate ballot boxes. Very interesting question here that's directed to Elections Alberta. Maybe Pamela can answer this. Why would you need returning officers for the Elections Alberta elections?
Yeah, so what we're recruiting for right now is actually the 2023 provincial general election. So our returning officers actually start quite a bit earlier to do map review. So they're involved in redoing our polling subdivision boundaries, enumeration, and election. So we just start a few years in advance.
Just a couple more questions I see it in the reading in the chat. Can someone designate a second person to vote via proxy? No. That's an easy one. Next question, do we need separate ballot boxes even if we're using voting tabulators? So in your tabulator bylaw, you're going to spell all this out. You're going to spell out how you're going to conduct your tabulator process in your bylaw under, I believe it's section 84, if I remember that one right. Can we refuse someone entry to the voting station if they refuse to mask? So we've contemplated this question before. I think the answer is no. What I would suggest is, again, you're going to try to comply with the health orders as closely as you possibly can. And if you do have that alternative voting station set up, try to direct them there if you can. Try to find a way to do this that infringes upon as little as possible upon both the health orders as well as the secrecy of the vote, etc. I think that brings us to the end of our questions.
There was a couple for me, if I can back up to them.
Be my guest.
All right. So one question about when the grant process will open up. So from what I understand, grants is paying out the grant amounts for Senate election and referendum automatically. We did have representatives from that area in Module 5 to come talk about what that process would look like. So if you missed Module 5, you might want to take a look at it again just to see how the grant piece is going to work. And then do we know when the order will be issued by the government with the referendum questions and the Senate nominees? So the latest date they have to issue the order and this election to be conducted is September 7th. And I realize that is very late in your planning structure. So we are hoping that we might see these orders earlier, but we haven't seen them yet. We're all planning that this event takes place and potentially up to September 7th before we have that final detail.
So I wanted to just go through the questions that we were asked. Sorry, I was juggling things around a little bit and I was a little bit unfamiliar with the setup here. So I thank you for your patience. I'd like to get to your questions now. So the first one is, there had been a comment about last session about having acrylic ballot boxes for institutional votes. And what if we wrap the boxes and top with plastic, which can be wiped? What I would suggest is that whatever you do, whether it's that or something like it, make sure that it's in accordance with the Chief Medical Officer of Health's guidelines. So consult the guidelines and see if what you're planning to do, how well that matches that particular process. Next question was, can we have one ballot box for all voting? And they're talking specifically, as it was clarified, about institutional votes and institutional votes. So there's not a lot of direction provided in the Act about multiple ballot boxes or not multiple ballot boxes in terms of what's in the Local Authorities Election Act. What I would suggest is, rather than give you an answer, I'm going to give you some considerations. What I think you need to consider at the end of the day is ensuring, first of all, what agreement do you have with the school divisions in terms of handing ballot boxes in? If you need to have if your agreement is that you're doing school elections, but the next day the ballot boxes are being provided to the returning officer of the school division, you'll want to consider how you're going to do that. Okay, so are you going to have them all in one box and then sort it out at the rest of the night and put it all in separate boxes? That could become kind of a tedious or difficult process itself, and it's a kind of a different thing, and it could introduce some different issues or concerns, or possibly lead to some mistakes. So I guess what I would say is that in the absence of some absolute clarity what's in the act, consider your process, and at the end of the night, how you're going to have you're going to so the night you have things preserved separately in the way that you need to keep them preserved separately. So that's something that's important. And Pamela might have something further to add. I don't know.
Yeah, I'd like to comment for Senate and referendum ballots. So for the purpose of institutional voting or voting at home, Elections Alberta has no concerns if you want to combine Senate and referendum into one ballot box so that you're not having to bring as many ballot boxes, especially if you're doing a bed-to-bed type vote. Just if that's the case, that you do decide to do that, make sure you have your process in place at the end of the night when you're doing the count to sort the ballots. You're still going to need to account for them and report results separately on each on their own form 19 RSE. But for some of the smaller municipalities where you're not seeing a lot of votes, we would be fine with that.
Okay. So somebody made a comment, which is a very good one. There is a difference between provincial elections in terms of providing two pieces of ID if you're not providing a driver's license. In municipal elections, it's one piece, but it's one piece that's on the list that has name and address. So the requirement is different. It is different for the different elections. Can a voucher be somebody from the same household? So the criteria in section 53.7 is they have to know the person, they have to know where they live, they have to have not been vouched for themselves. And that it doesn't expressly exclude somebody from the same household as being the voucher. Numbering, it says here, we number each ward starting at 1, correct? I think if you're talking about numbering the voting registers, yes, that's correct. At the, you would start for each, you would start at 1 for that. Now you might have, I won't go into that, but anyways, essentially the answer is yes. Let's just leave it at that. So vouching on it for hunter rights, thanks for providing your opinion on it. So I don't know if this provides more clarity or not, but hopefully that's some additional information that's helpful for you in providing it. It's an interesting question. It's one that you still may end up having to ask your legal counsel for absolute certainty. But thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, whoever it is that shared that. Post office boxes. So one more time for clarity. Yes. Basically, can you use post office boxes? Can you rely on, does somebody have to provide their civic address? Do they have to have a piece of ID that has a civic address? What about if they have a post office box? We're in the rural area. That's all we have is post office boxes. Post office boxes can be accepted if it is a reasonable distance from the local jurisdiction. Does this make sense? If they're from if they're relying on ID that says they're from a completely different place, which wouldn't make any sense, then that would be a different scenario. But we understand that in rural areas, and I grew up most of my life with just a post office box. So I totally understand that. Post office boxes are fine in that context. Could section 78.5.1, if an elector is physically unable to enter a voting compartment, deputy may set up a voting compartment elsewhere, be used to address the situation where a voter refuses to wear a mask? So we'll say, yes, you can consider a similar setup for voters who refuse to wear masks in the event that masks are still mandatory. I think you, of course, and with all the other provisions in here, you'll want to be cognizant of your cleaning protocols and your sanitization protocols for ensuring that you are protecting people from your end of things. Are there any guidelines on managing scrutineers and potential capacity issues related to COVID-19? So we continue to work with Alberta Health for guidelines on municipal elections in the event that we are still in a pandemic situation in October, or for the summer village elections, which will be sooner, of course. In the meantime, we've also have our document on the website on that elections overview page that provides some suggestions for virus transmission risk mitigation. Health is aware of the election planning timelines, and they're taking it to consideration in considering the information that they're releasing on it. So what about the instance where a voter has consciously spoiled a ballot on purpose, thinking it is a social comment? They get to the tabulator rejects it. Voters given the opportunity to return to the TRO to get a new ballot. They now understand that spoiling it on purpose is pointless with the electronic tabulators, and they decide to vote properly. Their initial actions were not inadvertent. Do we let them have a second ballot? The situation, the way the act is worded is it's not automatic. It requires a judgment call on the presiding officer. Okay, so I think you have to satisfy, the person has to satisfy that their actions were inadvertent in order for them to get that additional or that new ballot. It's not listed as thou shalt give them a ballot. It says you have to, the returning presiding officer has to be satisfied that that ballot has been handled inadvertently. So, would you have the basis to refuse it? As I say, it's not written as an automatic process. What if an elector refuses to accept one or more ballots that they're able to receive? Like, for instance, the provincial ballot from the DRO. You can't force anybody to take a ballot. When you do the voting register, you're checking off which ballots they're actually taking. Okay, and those are the ballots that you're issuing. It is not uncommon and I've definitely worked at stations where somebody walks in and says, "Just give me the ballot for the mayor. I don't want anything else." That happens. It's entirely possible that you will have that happen. In fact, you will not have every elector vote for every ballot that they're eligible to vote for. But it is their right to choose, to pick and choose which ballots they are able to receive. If they're eligible to vote for a contest, they can choose to vote for that contest or not. So that would be actually a fairly common circumstance. I think you can count on it that you will not have all electors accept ballots for all possible ballots that they could receive. How do we know if a person who wants to be a scrutineer has been convicted of an election offense? You don't. But the scrutineer signs the prescribed statement affirming that they are not ineligible to be a scrutineer, and that's on there. And it's quite a bit the same thing as the voting register. The eligibility, they're signing that they are eligible, and you would not necessarily know that they are, that they aren't. With a declined ballot, do you record it as a declined ballot? If they have marked one counselor, does it get counted? How would you know once it's deposited in the ballot box? Okay, so let's break this question down a little bit. With a declined ballot, do you record it as a declined ballot? No. You simply put the ballot in the ballot box. If they've really declined, if they haven't written anything, then that's going to come up as a blank ballot. And you're going to see that that's you could probably put two and two together at that point. Although some people do put in blank ballots. They go there, they decide they don't want to vote for anybody, but they don't want to make a fuss. So they come back, they hand in their ballot, it goes in the ballot box, away we go. So if they marked one counselor, for instance, would it get counted? Yep, it would. If they've declined to vote, the ballot goes into the ballot box. Okay. If you have to be very careful as to what you're being told by the elector. The elector hasn't read the act. Are they telling you that they've spoiled a ballot, or are they telling you that they're declining to vote? Be very cognizant and careful about what you're getting told by the elector and deal with the matter accordingly. I mean, somebody could come back and say, I'm declining to vote. I marked somebody, but I don't want to vote for any of them. Well, a declined vote's going to go into the ballot box. You can tell them that. Oh, well, maybe I don't want that. They inadvertently marked it that way. Well, I suppose theoretically you could issue them a new ballot. They could come back with their blank ballot and say, okay, now I'm declining to vote, and in goes the blank ballot. I mean, it's very hard to say exactly what circumstance will come up. But the point I'm trying to drive home is it's very important that whoever is on the receiving end of what the elector is saying is being very cognizant of what exactly the elector is saying, what they're actually telling you. What are they declining? Or are they actually, do they have a spoiled ballot? Are they actually asking for a replacement ballot? Be very careful about what they're saying, because a declined ballot, what it says in the act is it goes into the ballot box. And if they've marked somebody, well, it's not really a declined ballot. So what happens if they leave the building with their ballot and they come back in and ask to be put in the ballot box? What the rules say is that once they have done that, left the station with it, they forfeit their right to vote. So it's too bad, so sad at that point. Okay. They would lose their right. This next one, I was having a little bit of difficulty envisioning exactly what the scenario is, but I'll read it out. Our voting station is a memorial center with separate rooms for air and even a library, all enclosed in a larger building. Okay. What would you recommend us to delegate as the actual voting station? Last election, the lineups were long at 8 p.m. and they were designated the entire building the voting station. So there was massive lineup inside the building. Would it be wise to tunnel off the entrance to the room where we are using for voting and send staff outside near 8 to put a cutoff on the door to the tunnel? Okay, so if I understand this question right, yes, I've heard of this before, and I think it's probably not a bad practice. If you've got no way to physically keep inside the station every person that's there actively to vote, anybody who's there at 8 p.m. to vote, they've been in line and they are at there, but it's now 8 p.m., they're allowed the opportunity to vote. And yes, I've actually heard of this before, and I think it's a good practice to have somebody go to the worker, deputy returning officer, go to the back of the line. This is the end. It's 8 o'clock. These people are here to vote. They're going to be allowed to vote. Anybody else that comes in behind them. So now they're going to goaltend that section of the line, because that they're not going to allow any further person in. That's going to be the end of the line. So I think that's probably a good practice, but it's definitely something to consider when you're setting up and choosing your voting stations. How can you do so in such a manner that you're going to deal with some sort of situation like that? I've worked at a station where we had about 3,000 people vote at that station, but we were very fortunate that it was a very large room and we didn't happen to have a lot of voters at 8 o'clock. So we had the luxury of having everybody inside the building at the time that it closed up. But depending on the configuration of your station, you may not have that luxury. So the next best thing, I think, would be to have that worker out there closing off that line. Can the scrutineer review the elector register after the elector has completed the form? I think your scrutineer needs to come up as soon as they realize that there's an issue. It's not a timed competition as such. I think the intent here is, like when you say after the elector has completed the form, if it's just right after, the elector's just right there, you're just about to hand them their ballots. I think that's fine. I think you're still your scrutineer can still register that objection. But what they can't do is wait for the elector to leave the station and then raise an objection. That's not the time to do it. I think the time is of the essence. How exactly that could all come down depends very much on your circumstances. But the point is that you need to have your that your scrutineers need to make their objections when people are at the table collecting their ballots. That's when they need to be doing this. Section 67, persons at voting stations. Is the press permitted to take a photo of a candidate placed in their ballot? So we've seen this before, on the news where they show, leader of the such and such party, a federal party is, and then they show a picture of the person depositing their ballots. So what do you do in that case? So they must get permission. The person taking the picture must get permission from those in the voting station for FOIP considerations. If they can do it in such a way that the only person that they are taking a photo of is the candidate, then that might be okay. But the bottom line is they can't, they need to get, for FOIP considerations, they need to get that permission from anybody who might be in that shot. So really good comment from here earlier is we'd simply stage it at an earlier time when the voting hasn't begun. Yeah, I guess you could do that. I mean, you want to make sure that everybody kind of understands what you're doing there, and that it doesn't look like that person is somehow voting when they're not. Like, what I'm saying. Is there a DRO manual on the Municipal Affairs website? We cannot find it. It's in the process of getting updated. So we will have that shortly. So, and then this last question here, wondering about frequent reference to the deputy returning officer, widespread rural county have assigned one DRO and then hire polling staff. Is a key person at each a DRO. Okay, so what we're talking about here is presiding deputy returning officers. Every station has to have a presiding deputy. No matter how big or how small, there has to be a presiding officer, and anybody else is a deputy returning officer. So the part of this might be terminology. So they don't use the term polling staff or polling clerks in the LEA. They use the terms deputy returning officer, presiding deputy returning officer, returning officer. So the point is that at every station, there has to be a presiding deputy returning officer. That's the person that's in charge. Everybody else is a deputy returning officer, or unless they're like the returning officer or a constable or scrutineer or whatever. So I hope that answers that question. Okay, now what do I need to do now? I'm going to do this just for a second so that I can take a look at some other questions that have come in.
Lucian, there's a couple questions for Pamela, I think, there.
Okay.
After. And Pamela, the one I'm looking at, is there a deadline type date to know about provincial voting for Senate and referendum, as nothing has been announced yet?
That's correct. So the latest date that we can see in order in council is September 7th. We are still all hopeful that we're going to find out sooner than then. But right now we just have to proceed like as if it is for sure happening, but because September 7th is pretty late in your planning process.
And the other one, do you supply the ballot boxes for Senate and referendum?
No, we do not. So we're responsible to provide ballots, some of the posters, the blank elector template. We're not providing ballot boxes.
So if I could, some of the questions I'm just seeing in the chat section here, there's a question about the fact that somebody's had a approval in place since 1995 to have for a modified voting system, multiple voting stations within a voting subdivision. And does that, since that regulation no longer exists, does this section still allow this bylaw to remain valid? I don't have an exact answer for you on that one. I would suggest you may want to ask legal counsel if you want to perhaps take that question up with me offline. I can see what I can find for you on that one. That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to it. I'm just going to read through here. What happens if our candidate's elected by acclamation? You're still going to need to do Senate and referendum. I think that's been addressed. If a ballot is placed in the wrong ballot box, inadvertently and unknowingly, will the ballots are counted, or if the elector realizes the mistake as soon as it's being deposited? I'm assuming it stays in that box. Do we move the ballot to the correct box during the counting process? That's what I would do. I don't think I have seen it before where somebody has somehow, despite our best efforts, somebody placed the wrong ballot in the wrong box. We ended up opening vote boxes that night to count them, and we took, because we had them color coded, we could tell. And that's one of the things I'll say about color coding. That's really great for that. And we did migrate it back to the right box. We did not want to lose that would have that voter lose their rights to vote just on the basis of that. If you can do that, then that's what I would do.
With the
Voter
number of
registration.
ballots we're going to have, I think if any municipality ends up with ballots not in the wrong box, you deserve a prize.
Well, I've seen it both ways. I've seen both results. So voter registration forms require hundreds of printed forms for each polling station. Yes, it does. The list of voters no longer used. Well, most municipalities have never used a list of a voters list for municipal elections. Some may have, or may have in the past, or perhaps are doing so in this case. But yes, hundreds and hundreds, thousands in some cases of voting registers. It's going to be your biggest packet at the end of the night to throw into that ballot box. How can you tell if the voter is from the village or the town versus the county? You don't. You have, that's why you have them sign the statement. That's why scrutineers can raise objections. And that's why if you, as the returning officer, know that somebody is not eligible, you can also raise that objection. We have a ward system on an advanced day. We have all wards voting at one station. Can we have one box for referendum and one box for Senate? I think Pamela's answered that one already. Yeah, okay.
Yes, so it's not ward based. So at an advanced voting location, absolutely, you can have one Senate, one referendum.
Yeah. I saw one of the suggestions was to have the Form 13 on the website so that electors could print them off and bring them with them to the voting station. In this case, would the voting station just attach the numbered elector register form with the one that the elector brings in? I have never dealt with that circumstance where people bring in their own Form 13s. At the end of the day, I'm concerned about what they bring in a little bit. My own self, I think if you're going to issue Form 13s at the station anyhow, I would wonder as to what the value is of having people bring in their Form 13s. Perhaps the thought is that it would save a small amount of time to have them fill in their name and address ahead of time. You're going to issue a number at the station at the time that they come in, regardless. I'm not certain what I think about the use of outside Form 13s. I think you have to be very careful about ensuring that that they're coming in with the right form and to the right place, kind of a thing. What if we are concerned about people from just outside our municipality voting in the town election? I think we've basically answered this again. It's not a foolproof thing. If they're not getting if they're giving you a box number, how are you going to know for sure? And again, it comes down to them signing the statement, the scrutineers doing their job, and using your, if you're certain or you have reason to believe, you can also register that objection. And that's what we have to deal with that. How many times can a voter be issued a ballot that has been spoiled? I'll go back to my comment that this is not an automatic process. If it looks, at some point, you have to be satisfied that they've dealt with the ballot inadvertently. There's no set number of times for it. You may have somebody who's doing their best, but they are having difficulty doing it. they keep making the same mistake, or they make new mistakes. And that, I mean, there is a judgment call involved here. And I think you'll know at the time whether this is something deliberate or whether this is just something where they're just having some difficulties, but there's no set number of times that they can spoil ballots. It doesn't break it down that way in the act. So the PO boxes, again, I think we talked about that.
Lucian, can I just add something to that?
Yeah.
There's always the opportunity for municipalities to establish a bylaw for voter identification if they want to make people produce two pieces of ID with name and civic address to get around this whole thing. So that's just the other provision in the LEA that could address that. So just wanted to
allow for the number and types. You bet.
Okay.
Can a voter just request to see who is on a ballot before taking or not taking one? Or another way of stating this is, can they look at the ballot before they decide to take one? I've definitely been asked this before. I don't see any, one would hope that by the time a person comes to the station, they've already got it established as to who they're voting for. But the reality is, some people are going to ask to see a ballot ahead of time to see who's on the ballot, and they're going to use it to determine whether or not they're going to take a ballot. I don't think there's anything particularly secret or wrong or any reason why you shouldn't show a ballot to somebody. But Pam, do you have any thoughts on that?
Honestly, if someone does not want to vote on a particular ballot, I think the preference would be that you encourage them to place it as a blank ballot. Then they can take it behind the voting screen, make their decision if they don't want to vote. Otherwise, I'm not sure how that works in your process, that you're issuing ballots, but people are considering whether or not they're going to walk away with them or give them back. Sounds complicated for the election officers.
Okay. An elector could take a picture of his or her completed ballot and post it on social media. Are the election officials responsible in any way? Well, I don't know how you could be responsible. Somebody's behind the voting screen. There isn't a policy or a thing. There's nothing in the act about confiscating their phones or other devices. I don't see how you can stop this, and I don't see how the municipality would be responsible for it. I'm open to any other thoughts on that particular issue, but I just don't know how you'd be able to stop it, and I don't see how the municipality or the election officials would be responsible for that.
So yeah, that's true, Lucian. There's an offense in the LAEA 148 subsection 5 about replicating a ballot or taking a picture.
Yeah.
So that process to pursue an offense of that nature through the Provincial Offences Act, that would maybe come into play, and that person could be charged with an offense under that.
So I guess what I would suggest is, if a returning officer becomes aware of such a posting, they may want to contact, and this would be an enforcement matter. And Pam, would this be this is not third party advertising, and this is not financial. So this isn't part of what you guys enforce. This would be something that you certainly could contact the returning officer if they know about it. Could contact RCMP, and we could deal with it from that way. I don't know that there's an obligation for you to do that. I think anybody could bring that to the attention of somebody. I think probably most likely the person that's going to get a phone call is the returning officer. Somebody's going to call them up and say, so and so went and put this on their social media, and are they allowed to do that? And then the returning officer may wish to call the RCMP and see, because it is an offense. Can you refuse entry to a building where voting is being conducted if someone refuses to wear a mask? So I think we'd already kind of discussed this one. I don't know that you can. One would certainly hope a person would be following that. I think it's probably not a bad idea to try to, if you've got that sort of alternative voting station set up, that's probably a good place to direct them to.
Lucian, I'll just pipe up again. So no, you can't deny them access to the voting station if they refuse to wear a mask. So it's important for returning officers that you have a plan in place to respond to such a situation, to accommodate in your station. You're going to accommodate safe distancing and, even safety shields or something like that in the event that someone refuses to wear a mask. So those things should be covering that situation and keeping people safe.
Is there a substitute returning officer who is required by resolution also a deputy returning officer for purposes of election day? Not automatically. If the question is, can they be? They can be. There's nothing in the act that prevents substitute returning officer from also serving as a deputy returning officer. And I would imagine that in some cases, that's what's going to happen, is that there's this deputy that in the event that the RO becomes unavailable, then they become the returning officer by virtue of them being appointed by council as a substitute returning officer. But in the meantime, and if that doesn't happen, then they're a deputy returning officer that has been appointed and has been appointed by the returning officer and has signed the required statement, etc. I think we already talked about the ballot boxes for institutional vote. So the caps about providing scrutineers, I think, did you address that, Pamela, or?
I have been providing direct messages back to anyone that's asked us. Yeah, so our perspective right now is there will not be scrutineers for referendum, just because there's no one to appoint them. The legislation does not create, there's no candidates. So we don't anticipate seeing that.
Thanks for your suggestion, Ross, on asking people to turn their phones off. I certainly think you could do it. I don't think there's a downside to it. Of course, it doesn't stop somebody that just decides they're going to be a rebel and just say, oh yeah, it's turned off, and then they go ahead and they do it anyway, right? And are we able to post what the ballots look like around the voting station so people are able to see the ballot before getting a ballot and give them a heads up as to what it will look like? I think the returning officer is the only party that can actually post a likeness of the ballot. And anybody else that does it, it's an offense. Angela, do you have any thoughts on this too?
I would be hesitant to do that. I would hope that all of the advertising material before the election that the municipality puts out, or more so the Senate and referendum, that people will be able to have a heads up on who is running and things like that. That's where my head goes with something like this, to make sure people are more educated on the process beforehand than they, just walking into the station. That's my thoughts. But
it's nothing that I've ever done. I've never would have felt comfortable doing it myself. I don't think you're going to find something that specifically says you can't. And but you might want to think about that one. So I think we've answered. Sorry,
I was just going to say, we do this provincially. So we provide it as a mandatory piece in the polling places, that there's an expanded ballot poster. It allows someone that might have a vision impairment as well to see the ballot at a larger size, as well as, I guess, to see who's going to be on the ballot.
Okay.
So if that is something that through discussion it's determined is necessary or warranted, we can provide that for Senate and referendum.
Oh, thanks for that thought on it. So I believe we've answered all our questions. We are actually over our time. I want to again thank everybody for participating in today's session, and remind you that this is being recorded, so it will be on our site. And I just want to again thank my colleagues for their part and for assisting me in this process, and look forward to seeing the rest of you in upcoming training sessions. Thank you very much.